Ireland is a respected member of the European Union, a member of the OECD, and has a comprehensive network of international double tax treaties. It's a respected member of the international tax environment. And therefore, what this statement is doing is that it is underpinning that by stating that the Irish tax system will not be used as a way to access tax havens. So therefore, it gives confidence to multinationals that the Irish tax system is robust. The multinationals operating in Ireland will already be familiar with transfer pricing. They have to consider transfer pricing on the transactions between their Irish entities and foreign-related enterprises already. So therefore, what they now have to do is they have to consider how the Irish rules apply to those. And in fairness to the Irish authorities, in drafting these new provisions, they've tried to take as practical approach as possible. The Irish provisions are applying the established global OECD principles, so therefore there's nothing new essentially from an international tax context. And the documentation requirements in the Irish provisions are relatively benign from an international perspective, which means that it's likely that, say, for a standard multinational, if they're already having to comply with foreign transfer pricing regulations on particular transactions involving their Irish operations, the documentation that they might already have for those transactions should apply in Ireland, and it means that there might be a relatively low additional or incremental burden. It's also important that there's a generous lead time to the introduction of these provisions. The rules will apply from 2011 and onwards, and there's also grandfathering provision, which means that the existing arrangements that multinationals have will not be affected by these provisions, and therefore the multinationals are not going to feel like the reasons for them initially setting up in Ireland have been undermined by the introduction of these provisions. Previously, the power was always with the overseas related parties because they had domestic transfer pricing rules that they had to comply with, and because the Irish company might not have had such rules, it might have had to just accept slightly unfair pricing than it might otherwise have accepted. Now the Irish companies can push back and get fair remuneration for the services that they are providing and the goods that they are selling. I think the important point to make is that there are size thresholds before the rules kick in, and the size thresholds are relatively large. An organisation must have in excess of 250 employees or turnover exceeding 50 million or assets exceeding 43 million. So these are fairly high thresholds. But beyond the size thresholds, the rules will apply to domestic businesses just as they apply to multinationals. And the rules do introduce some fundamental new tax concepts that domestic businesses need to consider in how they structure their operations. However, the key point is that by international standards, the new Irish rules are not particularly onerous, and they have to be viewed in that context. Multinationals want to be certain that if they're locating operations in any particular jurisdiction, that nothing is going to occur which undermines that decision. And so therefore they want to tick off on the various risk factors. And a risk factor in locating in a low tax jurisdiction is that tax changes might be introduced in other jurisdictions which impinge on the effectiveness of using that low tax jurisdiction. The introduction of transfer pricing rules will help to send out a message that the Irish tax system is responsibly managed. It will help to preserve the integrity of the Irish tax system, and therefore that will help to give confidence to multinationals that it is a well-governed jurisdiction and it's a good place for multinationals to be locating.